It's 1 o'clock and we are streaming live, so you can start whenever you would like.
Hey, thank you so much, Madam Clerk. Are we ready to go? I see everybody there. And so I'd like to call the meeting to order. This is the City Council Rail Committee. Today is December 13, 2022, and I'm calling the meeting to order. And if the clerk could take roll.
Yes, ma'am. Councilmember Cormack?
Here.
Mayor Burt? I see Mayor Burt, but for the
Here.
Thank you. And Chair Koo?
Here.
Excellent. For the record, all present.
Thank you. And now we go to oral communications on items that is not on the agenda. If Madam Clerk could let me know if there's anybody who would like to speak.
Yes, ma'am. We do have one member of the public. Sandy, if you would like to unmute, you can speak for up to 3 minutes. Sandy, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to make a public comment?
Yes, I did. Thank you. My name is Sandra Weiss. I live at 101 Alma Street, and I'm here on behalf of myself and others at 101 to advocate for installing a quiet zone at the grade crossing at Alma and Palo Alto Streets. The council has been told on other occasions of the disruptions to people's conversations and general quality of life issued by loud train horns. So I will not address them here. I will instead talk a little bit about safety issues. As members of the City Council, your primary responsibility is to keep your constituents as safe as possible. Therefore, the analyses of the Federal Railroad Administration, which is an administrative unit of the U.S. Department of Transportation, should be of interest to you. The Federal Railroad Administration's analyses show grade crossings in quiet zones were generally as safe as they were when train horns were sounded. To repeat, grade crossings in quiet zones were generally as safe as they were when train horns were sounded. In other words, the blasts from the train horns did not lower the number of accidents at grade crossings. Another point I wish you to consider is that the horns are located on the roofs of the lead locomotives. My own experience is that the blasts are heard for a longer period of time by those living at 101 than those waiting at track level gates. The ringing of the gates at track level are also audible earlier than the horn blasts from the train. Therefore, the blasts do not improve warning times. Thus, if the gates comply with the Department of Transportation's regulations about quiet zones, and there does not appear to be more accidents after quiet zones are instituted, I strongly recommend that you implement a quiet zone at the Alma and Palo Alto Streets grade crossing as soon as possible. Thank you for allowing me to address you. I'm done.
Thank you for your comments. Adrian Brandt, if you'd like to speak for up to 3 minutes, you can unmute and make your comments.
Thank you. I would like to speak in favor of quiet zones. I just wanted to point out that Brightline, the semi-high-speed rail service in Florida, going from Miami up to West Palm Beach, has always used quiet zones. I've actually seen them functioning when we stayed in West Palm Beach. And the SMART service, Sonoma Marin Area Rail Transit, that's been running for a number of years now from San Rafael, from Lexington all the way up to northern Santa Rosa, a line length comparable to Caltrain's line. That service is also fully covered by quiet zones at each of the jurisdictions. They felt like dominoes. I can't remember who was first, but the residents asked for quiet zone with specter of passenger trains coming. And one after another, the various counties and city jurisdictions up and down that line followed suit. I know Petaluma was clearly one that was even at odds with the rail agency, but What I wanted to point out, though, is that quiet zones do not, contrary to popular belief, ban the use of horns. They just only ban the mindless rote blowing of the horns for no particular reason or hazard. What quiet zones do allow, and still occurs, is that horns are blown for cause, just as we do with our cars and trucks. The whole principle behind blowing horns, I think, stems from the days when trains were a lot of unprotected rural and farm crossings that did not have modern crossing protection equipment, such as at every single California crossing and all the crossings on all the quiet zones as mandated by the government. And so what actually winds up happening is that horn is blown copiously with these incidents that do occur on lines with quiet zones when the engineer sees a potential hazard or something approaching the tracks, a vehicle, a person, whatever. And this is documented in video evidence. It did not prevent the collision that occurred. So we clearly, unfortunately, are engaging in safety theater in this country with the horn regulations that go way back in time to a much simpler grade crossing scenario than we have here. And indeed, if you pull up YouTube videos of crossings in Europe, even very busy ones that have ICE, high-speed trains, freight trains, etc. I was just reviewing some of these videos recently. There's absolutely no horn blowing, and the crossing gates don't even make sounds. So I think we can do this here. It's safe, and it's time we do it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Okay, Elizabeth Alexis, you can unmute and make your comment up to 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. As long as everyone is speaking about quiet zones, I do want to reiterate our support for quiet zones. As Adrian said, they've been very useful everywhere. One thing I want to mention that people don't talk about enough, as far as we're concerned, are something called wayside horns, which allow, instead of having the train have the horn on the train, you have it next to the actual crossing. In studies, these are just as safe as, if not safer, than having them on the train, and it constrains the noise to that immediate area. It dramatically changed the distribution of the noise, and the FRA considers these to be equivalent and the same as horns on the train, so there's no need to do any upgrades to any of the station areas, and they're quite affordable, and it's something I think we should look at for the whole city, even for the crossings where we're not looking at quiet zones. The noise effects in the middle of the night are very real for people, even if they don't notice it anymore. When you look at people's heart rates and sorts of things, you're definitely disturbing everybody's sleep for no particular reason. Thanks.
Okay, Chair Koo, that's the last request to speak.
Thank you so much, Madam Clerk. And then we move to our verbal update from the interagency activities on the interagency activities.
Thank you. I'm not sure. Do we want to take this in order, or staff could go first, or we have Caltrain here? Not sure.
I think we can just Caltrain to the action item, and unless there's something else besides what is on the service agreement, but we can do staff, and then if there's anything from VTA.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Caltrain does have an update as well that they would like to provide.
Well, you can take it in city first, then.
Thank you. I'm more than happy to jump in. I think especially following the public comments, I want to note that Ripon was in a field diagnostic meeting today with the CPUC and Caltrain regarding quiet zones, and we're currently reviewing an initial concept plan. So we are making progress on the quiet zone process for Palo Alto Avenue, OMA. I also want to note that attached to the agenda today, there was a matrix that we added following the request to clarify which of the different technical design criteria, the list of that design criteria, which we'd been seeking clarification on, and the constraints that these have for different locations or alternatives that we're considering. I wanted to bring up the VTA ad hoc committee, which met, goodness, was it last week? I'm losing track of time. Was it the week before? Maybe it was the week before. But I guess some of the key items from that, want to mention that the ad hoc committee discussed the roles and responsibilities of the committee. I believe one of the topics that came up was that the committee is hoping to provide a greater role in seeking funding and pursuing projects in a collaborative manner. I think that perhaps we can ask Mayor Burt to provide additional context if he'd like. I also raised for the committee the consideration of cost sharing with Caltrain, sharing the cost with cities on grade separation. And final note on that is that the next VTA ad hoc meeting is scheduled right now for February 24th. Also, something that you should have received was a memo that we received from Caltrain last week on the San Francisco Creek Bridge. We received that memo, I believe, on Thursday. The memo provided some additional details on the different alternatives that are have been considered by Caltrain, and we met with Caltrain staff after the receipt of the memo, and we indicated that we'd like to see additional details regarding the alternatives and really specifically regarding rehabilitation. And finally, before I turn it over to Caltrain for both this item and the next item, I just wanted to note that yesterday we had another meeting with Caltrain staff. And so I just want to note that today they'll be providing a high-level overview of the process and structure of the service agreement. However, just want to note that staff are still in negotiation with Caltrain over the scope of services and the fees. And with that, I'll pass it over to Caltrain.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Before we do that, I was wondering if Mayor Burt has any updates from the VTA ad hoc committee to provide.
No, I think Philip covered the main part of it, but one of the things that this ties into discussions with Caltrain too is as Caltrain has now embraced the need for a whole corridor-wide plan, they don't currently have funding that is dedicated to even their services in supporting grade crossings within that plan, and the need to begin to look at them receiving funding from MTC or another agency in support of that, I think is something we're all going to want to look at supporting. And I did have one question on quiet zones. The ability to do the wayside horns and possibly wayside lighting for pedestrians, because it's really pedestrian safety that we're most at risk. Is that part of the design and direction that we're heading?
Good afternoon, Mayor Burt and members of the committee. Ripon Bhatia, Senior Engineer with Parc Transportation. So we did meet with CPC and Caltrain, and they are looking at different ways. We are not considering wayside horn as the first option. We are considering a quiet zone, complete quiet zone as a first option. So if that does not is not approved, then the second option could be considered as a wayside horn.
Okay, well, I'd be interested in as a follow-up, maybe we can at the next meeting go a little deeper into these alternatives, because I was glad that some of the commenters brought that up, because it makes perfect sense to me that you could have audible and even visual flashing at the pedestrian locations that would not have spillover effect on neighbors and things, but would add another layer of safety. So I'd be interested in that in the future, but we don't need to dive into it today.
Just to add on to that is that we believe that we would meet the quiet zone requirements for Palo Alto Avenue.
Yeah, so meeting a minimum requirement is one threshold, but asking ourselves what's the right balance between that minimum standard and what we might want to do to help assure maximum safety is another one. Sure. Yeah.
I want to ask, is Caltrain going to start on item 2 right now, or is there a separate update on item 1?
Thank you. There is actually an update that Caltrain would like to provide ahead of the item that they'll be presenting.
Okay, because I wanted to go out to public comments after for this item as well. So please, thank you for being here today, and Caltrain members, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Nevi Dhaliwal, Government Community Affairs Officer at Caltrain. And before I dive into Caltrain's general update today, I'd like to reintroduce and introduce my colleagues today. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Rob Bernard.
Rob Bernard, thank you again for having us here, Deputy Chief Rail Development at Caltrain.
Good afternoon, Nicole Sultanoff, Deputy Director of Capital Program Planning. And since it's my first time in front of the rail committee members, I'll give a quick introduction of myself. So as part of my role, I oversee capital projects during the conceptual planning phase as part of the planning team. And I also lead the development of Caltrain long-range capital improvement plan. Prior to this, I was a San Jose project manager at Spur, where I led the research and advocacy for the transformation of Diridon Station into a multimodal hub. And I moved to the US from France, where I started my career as a capital delivery project manager and oversaw capital projects as part of the development of transit-oriented district, as part of the extension of Paris metro system to the suburbs, also known as the Grand Paris Express. And I hold an urban engineering degree from France. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for being here.
So I did just want to take a moment to, wow, that is very close. Sorry about that. Thank the city and city staff for providing us with this forum to provide informational updates to you all and keep you in the loop on what's going on at Caltrain. Many of these updates include projects that are underway, and I want to preface by saying that we understand many of the questions you may have may require some additional follow-up, and our team is happy to do that digging. So previously, Caltrain was invited, next slide, please. Great, thank you. So Caltrain was invited to the September Rail Committee to present about the San Francisco Bridge during a study session. And per the request of Mayor Burt, we delivered the alternative analysis memo to the city by email, and you will be receiving a physical copy soon. That provides the analysis that took place and our staff's ultimate recommendation to move forward with a bridge replacement. As Philip mentioned, we are looking forward to setting up some time with you all to provide a preliminary opportunity to run through the memo and to discuss key takeaways and any questions you might have. Additionally, I wanted to provide a brief update on Caltrain electrification. This project will be replacing 75% of our existing aging diesel fleet with the state-of-the-art electric trains. When completed in 2024, the project will provide faster, safer, and more reliable service while enhancing equity and access for underserved communities. Crews are currently installing and testing a new signal and gate activation system at Churchill Avenue and Palo Alto Avenue crossings. There will be temporary flagging of those crossings this coming weekend as they run tests along the segment of the corridor. As we look forward to passenger service in 2024, there are a number of critical construction and test milestones that need to be completed in 2023. We will continue to meet with the city on these items as they affect the city. And the Peace Outreach team will reach out to you all, and I'm very happy to take any questions or concerns back to them today, especially ahead of a very busy weekend. Previously, Councilmember Cormack, you had asked about the train sets, and I'm happy to provide some additional detail on that. Wanted to let you know that in total, we are anticipating 19 train sets, and that arrival will be happening in fall of 2024, and there will be 7 cars per train set. Moving on, ongoing coordination with VTA. So as was already touched upon earlier, Caltrain has been participating in the VTA Ad Hoc Grade Separation Committee to increase coordination, transparency, and collaboration with agencies and cities along the corridor. We also have been meeting outside of Rail Committee and providing updates on various projects affecting the entirety of the corridor through our local policymaker group and our city county staff coordinating group. And that really provides a focus on the corridor crossing strategy, which we understand are important to the communities along the corridor. And back in September, I had provided a brief update on this, and a few of the members of the committee have been receiving regular updates on our corridor crossing strategy as well. But I wanted to take a moment to just dive into that a little bit. Next slide, please. The corridor crossing strategy was identified as a multi-year effort in the Caltrain business plan. In close partnership with core cities, counties, and regional agencies, the corridor crossing strategy will develop a corridor-wide strategy and programmatic approach for the organization, project development, funding, and ultimately the implementation of grade separations or closures. Existing grade separation projects will continue in parallel with the corridor crossing strategy. The corridor crossing strategy will be developed in 2 concurrent paths: crossing delivery guide to address some of the nearer term challenges and a program strategy development for the longer term. The crossing delivery guide will outline the current processes and procedures, roles and responsibilities, and design standards to provide jurisdictions a better understanding of the current process. This guide will reside online and help provide near-term benefits for grade separation projects by outlining the current delivery process. The current project delivery approach for crossing projects provides an opportunity for a shared corridor vision to be developed. This vision will help balance the ambitions of stakeholders with the complex web of organizational, technical, and funding challenges to create an implementable action plan. The corridor crossing strategy will help establish an understanding of the identified 4-track segments from the 2040 service vision. This includes some technical work to further refine the limits as well as guidance on how to implement. Next slide, please. As a part of the corridor crossing strategy, technical topics will explore opportunities and constraints to guide and inform the development of the program. As you can see, there are 7 categories that are being looked at, including project introduction, and for the sake of time, I will not outline all of them, but through organizational and technical capacity. The project's engagement approach encourages active participation from our stakeholders to garner consensus on an informed corridor strategy and vision. This corridor crossing strategy team will be presenting to the groups on a regular basis to keep stakeholders apprised of project developments and guide. Additional engagement opportunities will arise as the project progresses. Next slide, please. Perfect. And I just wanted to, I know this was quite a lot of information, but I wanted to take a moment to address any questions or concerns.
Thank you for that. If it's all right, if we could just hold our questions for a little bit while we go out to the public, then we'll come back to the committee. Thank you. Madam Clerk, will you see if there's any public comments?
Now, if someone would like to make a public comment on the verbal updates, please raise your hand now. Madam Chair, I don't see any requests to speak.
Super, thank you. So come back to the committee. Any questions?
Lydia, can you see us? I can't tell.
I can see you.
Okay, great.
Please go ahead and
Okay.
speak.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. Where to start? Okay. Why don't I start with the coordination with VTA? It's a little hard to understand which groups are in charge of what and wherever, and understand the ad hoc, right? It's sort of finding its way to figure out what its scope is, et cetera. So let me just ask a specific one. Dahlia Shazan, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, was describing a stakeholder advisory team, for example. Where does that fit in all of this, and who's on it and who chooses? Is that a VTA thing? That's you guys.
Correct. And you are specifically referencing for the corridor crossing strategy? Or
I think that's what it's part of.
Yeah. So Caltrain, our team, Dahlia is working on identifying various stakeholders and who's going to be engaging in that process and that stakeholder advisory process. So correct, Caltrain will be leading that effort.
So like, do the cities get to make suggestions to you? Can people apply?
That's a really great question. So our project team has currently been in what we call phase 1 of doing just initial information gathering from our internal teams. And I will make sure to check in with our project team for the corridor crossing strategy on when they plan to engage these advisory stakeholders. But I do know that that is a component of the plan. I just don't have the timing of when that will be happening.
Okay, well, I'll be interested to hear what my colleagues have to say, but it certainly seems like we could pretty easily come up with a list for you of all the people who, we would hope that you would consider including. And I hope that's not a limited group. Okay. And then is this the time? No, it's probably in the next item to talk about, Mr. Barnard, all the discussions about alternative contract delivery. That would be in the next item.
That is correct.
Okay. So I thought Director Hendricks' comments at the first ad hoc committee meeting were bang on and particularly instructive. And I have not, unfortunately, had enough hours between, when all these are sent out in the other meetings to watch the second meeting. So where are we in terms of like the Gantt chart that shows us when each of these is happening? The other places, to learn that Mountain View is going to do both of theirs at the same time was certainly news to me. So when would we expect seeing that, and in what format do you all anticipate working with us? Because I feel like we've got a lot of groups popping up and it's a little hard for me to understand where responsibility lies.
Thank you for the question. So for the first element, the Gantt chart, at the second ad hoc committee, the VTA, as part of the overall program approach, showed the Gantt chart for all of the projects, how they are laid in time.
Okay.
For Caltrain, which currently has a service agreement to advance 2 projects with Mountain View for the Castro and for the Ringstar, we provided that detail at the second meeting that Director Hendricks asked for, with here's the activities that have occurred, here's the activities that will occur, who's responsible for them, what's the due date, and what are the challenges that the team is encountering in order to accomplish those. So we also provide a quarterly report as part of the VTA process that has all that information in greater detail we're also using. But we're only 2 of those projects that we're reporting at that committee meeting.
Okay. So I'll just say to staff, watch a 3-hour video is one thing, but if there were those charts, it'd be super helpful. There's something in between saying, here's a link to the video. And by the way, here's the 2 charts that, were asked for the time before. Just from a time management standpoint, it'll be particularly important next year. I presume there'll be new council members and it's going to be harder for them to absorb this quantity of information. So thanks for the backup on that. Okay, love that it's corridor crossing strategy. So props for using that terminology, because it's what regular people understand. And then the 4-track refinement, again, I think that's in the next one, right? In terms of what fits in which thing. Okay. I think your 7 categories, I don't quite understand the flow. Are they supposed to be logical? Are they chronological, or they're just all separate?
They're all core components to the corridor crossing strategy. And so not necessarily chronological, but elements of what the corridor crossing strategy will take into consideration as it progresses.
So it's interesting because it seems to me like it's being informed by what's going on as opposed to sort of laying out like, here's how we're going to do things. Am I understanding it correctly, or are you envisioning it as something else?
I think right now the corridor crossing strategy is taking a look at what's been done thus far. But we'll also get to the point where we're looking at forecasts and what's coming up in terms of standards and processes, because we understand that our cities along the corridor are looking for a general understanding of what that'll look like. And so we'll continue to keep you all updated at the LPMG as we continue to progress in the crossing strategy project and as it develops.
Okay. And then just a comment for our staff. We occasionally get verbal reports on LPMG at council, but we don't get anything in more depth. Like, it was interesting listening to Director Hendricks talk about that. I think some work, either this committee and or staff or whatever going forward, is going to have to figure out how to meter that flow of information, because it's going to be more constant with a lot more detail. And I think everyone on council is going to need to have it, not just whoever is on rail committee, assuming there's a rail committee next year. Thanks so much.
Chair Koo, I'm
Yes,
ready.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So just following up on Councilmember Cormack's last couple of questions. At LPMG, we get good presentations often. I don't recall if it was the last meeting that had the timeline on the corridor strategy that I thought was real helpful and informative. We could see when when you were planning on taking on kind of the design and technical standards and engineering standards, which are, as you know, are real important to us. Can we routinely have that just provided to the council, whatever is the written material that LPMG receives? And great. Okay. And then on the electrification, is it still looking like full passenger service in 2024?
That is correct.
Okay. All right. Hopefully so. No, I'd be happy if it's by the end of 2024. I'm just fearful that it'll slip further. And then I did want to dive in. As you know, we've been talking about how critical us getting clarity on, or at least a narrowing of the segment that's being considered for 4-track, how critical that is to our grade crossing refinement of our alternatives, and that even certainly alternatives are more impacted if they might be having to allow for 4 tracks, not build for 4 tracks at this time. And it drives some of our decision making, and we might have ruled in or ruled out an alternative if we knew that 4-track was or wasn't going to be needed in an area. So it's holding us up. But we only recently at the first VTA ad hoc meeting came to realize that even though we've been asking for clarification for a couple of years, we had been told that the zone was anywhere from South Mountain View to the north edge, south edge of Mountain View to north edge of Palo Alto. But lo and behold, a year and a half or so ago, Mountain View had requested and had a council direction to request elimination from Castro to the south edge of Mountain View, and that had been agreed upon, and therefore apparently the zone being considered for 4 tracks had already been narrowed, and there was some way in which a city could pursue that response from Caltrain that we were never made aware of. That basically that action preceded you folks joining Caltrain, but nevertheless, this is something that is real importance to us. Philip, I know that you had requested from Mountain View kind of what is in their public documents on their requests and what had transpired there. Have we received that information?
Yes, ma'am, but we did receive a letter that was sent to the Caltrain, and we did follow up with Caltrain also briefly, and they have not responded to Mountain View yet. But that's
They have not responded to Mountain View?
That's what we are, we are aware of it.
So that's our understanding, of course.
Well, that wasn't Caltrain. I'll just say that at that VTA ad hoc committee meeting, that's not what was communicated. What was communicated there was that it had been responded and that the Castro Station would not be considered in the 4-track zone. So clarity would help.
Mayor Byrd, appreciate that opportunity. As you mentioned in your opening, that those conversations preceded the team that's here today. And so we are reaching back into the folks that were here to ask those questions. Taking a look at the width of the right of way at the Mountain View Station to the south, it's only like 68 feet wide, which doesn't accommodate a 4-track segment, in the area north of Mountain View is wider. So there's some work to do of what was done before and said before, but we're committed to find that out.
So one question is, has there been such a decision? And then another one is, what's the process and the basis for those decisions? So Churchill is in that same sort of width. And so if that's clearly the basis, and we would agree that trying to have a 4-track in that narrow a corridor is extremely difficult at best. And we went through this all the way back in 2009 and 10 with the high-speed rail with 4 tracks. And that was one of the issues at the time then, is how narrow our corridor is in the vicinity of Churchill. I think it even goes a little bit below 68 feet.
Yeah, I think at Churchill it's 65.
There we go. So is it indeed? We're done.
I'm just saying what the width is.
I know, but if 68 ruled it out in Castro, then 65 sure ought to rule it out here.
As always, the details matter a lot.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So if we can get into those details soon rather than later, that would be really important to us. So I guess to put folks on the spot, how soon can we get clarity on what's happened in Mountain View and what's the process by which we can quickly go through a similar consideration, at least where we're most constrained? We also have issues south of Churchill, including the Oregon crossing and the other issues in the Charleston East Meadow, but the most obvious ones are where we're in a 65-foot corridor. So how can we see if we can agree on a timeline to resolve this?
Excellent question, Mayor Burt. As we have been engaging with the City of Palo Alto staff on a service agreement to engage our technical teams in order to address those questions. So it depends on the speed at which we resolve what the scope of the work, what's the cost of the work, what are the deliverables, and what's the, for that particular portion of work, what's necessary to do that analysis to answer and ask that question. But there's some ongoing conversations with City of Palo Alto staff and our staff to work out the details to execute the service agreement in order to solve that. If you want it done with a high level of analysis.
So
because it is the overall picture for the 4-track is part of the corridor crossing study and looking at it at a corridor scale. But to take a look at, if we need an answer today, the other path was to do a service agreement and just look at this specific question at this specific area and have the technical team take a good hard look at it. Because we do have agreements with high-speed rail that we are required to honor, and we do have agreements with Union Pacific Railroad that we have to honor. So there's some homework to do.
And with Mountain View, they made that request under an existing service agreement?
It was before my time, but we have an agreement with Mountain View. They have been paying for our time.
Okay. Yeah, I hadn't assumed that the 4-track narrowing would be part of a service agreement because, as you say, it's part of the need.
It depends on the timeline.
But to move it forward, you're saying you'd need it under a service agreement.
We have a separate process with separate funding to look at the quarter scale. If we want to do something that's a one-off to look at one thing, we have to engage a group in order to do that analysis.
Okay.
Happy to lean into that work.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll wait further clarification on what happened in Mountain View and then figure out where we go from there. And then lastly, on the Creek Bridge, setting aside for a moment that we need to articulate more clearly to Caltrain some of the things that we verbally shared last meeting about the implications of moving forward with a bridge replacement before we've looked at the Palo Alto Avenue / Alma grade crossing, which is the lowest on our priorities, and before we're really looking at what redesign potential that might go along with in the University Avenue station and the straightening of the tracks. And so I think we'll need to put that out in as clearly as we can as part of a response now that we've received your letter. But one of the things that I went out and looked at the bridge and the creek there, as well as that we got an update from an arborist study that is nearly complete that had been in the works for several years. And one of the things that leaped out to me was the terrible corrosion condition of the bridge. And it has not been receiving, it looks to me from at least a decade of overdue rust removal and repainting to prevent rust corrosion and potential contribution to stress corrosion as a result of that. Are you aware of how bad the corrosion is on that bridge?
Mayor Bird, as we reported at our last rail committee meeting, that we did send a team out there to do 3 weekends worth of analysis and took a look at kind of a look under the hood to look at those things that you're talking about. And they did do an analysis of the bridge's condition and did take samples of the material in order to gauge what its strength is, and did our analysis in order to do loading. So we have taken a good look underneath the hood in terms of the state of the corrosion.
So just so everybody gets a chance, I'll just pass this around. This is how bad it is today. Yeah. And so, you know, it's one thing to hear things secondhand. I don't know if you've received photographs. I was shocked.
Yeah, I've gone out and walked not on the bridge because I didn't have my PPE in, but I've done what you have done is from afar, taking a look at it.
Yeah. So I have a concern that no matter which direction we head of whether we repair or replace, that the lack of essentially paint maintenance refurbishing, and I know the process that goes through to replace corrosion resistant coatings on steel structures, that we're jeopardizing further deterioration, and that it's just not been receiving normal maintenance aside from whatever inherent deterioration occurs over its 120-year lifespan. Right now, that deterioration is being accelerated as a result of lack of corrosion protection. And I'm not able to say to what degree, but it's really apparent, and that was a concern to me. And my gut response is that needs to be placed as a priority. No matter which path we go on, this should be dealt with as promptly as possible, because we're compounding a problem, and it's nowhere near proper maintenance. It's just I'm shocked at that. So okay, and that's all I had on this part of your presentation, and then we have another discussion in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions. With regards to the quiet zone, could you kind of briefly give me a process of, you just said that today Ms. Bhatia was at a meeting to discuss is it the noise diagnostics? So what is the next steps before we actually get to implementation of quiet zones?
So the next steps is to do an outreach process to make sure that our community has a time to provide input, and then seek CPUC approval by adopting that through City Council. And the improvements that are reflected in the conceptual plan that are acknowledged and approved by CPUC and JPB will then needs to be constructed in order to request a quiet zone from FRA. So this process is ensuring that we are doing all the improvements that are necessary to be able to be eligible for a quiet zone. And once we have all the improvements in place, then we can request Federal Railways Authority to establish a quiet zone.
I see. Okay. Thank you so much for that. It helps understanding how the process goes and also set expectation. For the members from Caltrain, on the slide that you have the program strategy technical categories, I was just wondering, are those already developed?
That's a great question, Vice Mayor Koo. We are working on, these are the technical categories that have been identified as core components of the corridor crossing strategy study, but we have not, or at least today, I would like to take this question at least back to our team and get you a little bit more information on it. I would hate to say something, be quoted on it, and then have to come back and walk back. So I will be sure to get you additional information on that.
Thank you, thank you. The last question is, so Mayor Burt brought up, the width for the 4-track, the corridor width where the limitation starts at 68, I believe. So how much feet does a 4-track need?
A 4-track needs 95 feet. If you have 15 feet between each of the tracks and 25 feet clearance from the center of the track to the nearest obstruction on either side, it's 95 feet. But that's providing full width.
Okay, 95 feet. Thank you. I'm done with my questions also. Thank you so much. It kind of is eye-opening. But if there's nothing else from the committee or staff, then we can move to our next item, which is, I'm sorry, one more question. What is the minimum feet then? If it's 95 is the maximum, what is the minimum for the 4 tracks?
So that would be a design variance that would have to go through an exhaustive evaluation process. But the standard is 15 feet between the tracks. And then from the center of the track to the nearest obstruction to the wayside is 25 feet.
Oh.
Now, if there's a pole in the way or a slight foundation in the way or an abutment in the way, there's a design variance process to walk through that if it could be an exception to that 95 feet.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we can move to item number 2. I'm sorry, it's not item number 2, it's action item number 1, which is again Caltrain presentation and the discussion on the service agreement.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon again, Chair Koo, Mayor Burt, Councilmember Cormack, again, Rob Bernard, Caltrain Deputy Chief of Rail Development. Again, I want to thank the committee for this opportunity to present information on Caltrain's approach to how we support Great Separations Project in the current framework that we have. As we seek to work collaboratively with project sponsors and local jurisdictions. During Caltrain's last presentation in September, Committee Member Cormack, you asked, what was our biggest lesson to learn? And we replied that it was early participation by Caltrain had value as we explore the arts of the possible and try to help solve those complex technical issues. Mayor Burt, as you heard at the VTA ad hoc committee last time, that Don Cameron, who is the Public Works Director for Mountain View, who we have a service agreement with, expressed the same lesson learned as the early and active involvement with Caltrain does have value. Next slide, please. Over the past couple of years, Caltrain has demonstrated our commitment to be a partner with the city of Palo Alto. We participated in the Connecting Palo Alto study. We've also reviewed alternatives alongside your community advisory panel, your expanded community advisory panel, and ongoing coordination with major projects. We are really proponents and advocates of this early coordination as we seek to streamline these processes. We want to encourage efficiency and definitely cost savings. We're all stewards of public funds. We want to be cost effective These resources are very scarce, very hard to get, a lot of competition for them, and it's essential that we use them wisely as we try to serve our communities. That is why we're here today, to share our view of the benefits of Caltrain's early involvement when we're planning these grade separations along the alignment. We really also want to build on our lessons learned as we've done these grade separation projects. For reference, one of the lessons learned is that the optimal timing to do those analysis of the alternative contract delivery methods was the best time to help make those choices. Or constructability, because the how really matters in order to minimize the impact to the communities and the traveling public. That really has to be explored early in the design process. And technical issues like environmental. Who does the state CEQA process? Who does the federal NEPA process? Whose role and responsibility for each one of those? We find that early involvement has value to explore that art of the possible. We have some very clever engineers at Caltrain. We have hundreds of pages of criteria, specifications, and drawings. These are well-established criteria. They were last updated in August of 2020, but they are hundreds of pages. There are many sections that are shall, black and white, but there are many areas that are guidance that require judgment based on the specific condition, the specific location of the project. And Caltrain retains that authority over those areas that have required judgment to meet our fiduciary obligation to protect the public health and safety and Caltrain's workforce. But we want to be a valued partner and help the community deliver their projects. We're here to solve problems, to be a partner, but also to leverage Caltrain's expertise and leverage this great regional asset that's been here for 150 years. How do we maximize its potential to the communities we call home? Enhance livability, enhance sustainability, help drive the economic engine of the Bay Area. How can we leverage that in a way that aligns with the community's vision that they see for their communities? And each community has a different vision of how they want to see their community grow. Next, please. Over the years, Palo Alto has identified key questions we talked about earlier today that need resolution to help refine the grade separations design. In June, we received 2 letters from Palo Alto. One was the request to review and respond to key technical questions that we talked about, and the other is the 4-track refinement request. These responses fall into 2 broad categories. Those that are on the left-hand side of the screen really need those project-specific answers because the details matter a lot. The second requires more of a system-wide approach. For those that require those project-specific answers and Caltrain staff expertise to implement our design guidelines, Caltrain staff has begun our conversations with city staff on developing that mechanism in order to engage our staff to answer those technical questions. And we've started that discussion, just preliminary, here's the first draft for those third-party service agreements, because there's a lot of discussion on what the right scope is. What's the deliverables? What are the milestones? What are the billing rates? But walk through that in great level of detail. And we've just started those conversations. But we're looking to answer those specific technical questions you see on the left-hand side regarding vertical clearance, thickness of the bridge deck, and the curve of the track at Palo Alto. The fourth item on that list on the left-hand side is Caltrain's approach to allowing cities to use that newly created area underneath elevated structures. This is really a case-by-case review. It really is, what is the specific use and the configuration? We're required to do a threat and vulnerability analysis for use of those spaces. So the details really do matter on those. The second group on the right-hand side are planned to be addressed as part of the corridor crossing study. We've received separate funding for this. Some of the VTA's Measure B money, some of SFCTA's Prop K money in order to do this corridor-wide study. And so this is taking a look at those things at a corridor scale. Now know that Caltrain does have a standard procedure, G24, to request design variances on a case-by-case basis. There are for unique situations. They're very rare. They're kind of a last resort after the exhaustive analysis says that we can't use the criteria, but we need a variance on a case-by-case basis. And of course, they never allow us to not meet federal regulations. However, any change that impacts the maximum allowable grade or freight standards does require an additional process. And that is for two reasons. One, of course, is Union Pacific Railroad. We have a trackage right agreement between Caltrain and Union Pacific that describes our contractual obligation and the freight operator's rights. UP has a right to use both mainline tracks. JPB has an obligation to maintain that right-of-way at the levels necessary to accommodate UP's current and future freight operations to allow UP to maintain competitive service levels. So if we're going to make a change, we need UP's concurrence that we meet that standard of maintaining their competitive service levels. The second is our commitment to high-speed rail. We have an agreement with high-speed rail where JPB is not allowed to take any action that would effectively preclude or make materially more complicated or expensive for high-speed rail. So if you look at these project-specific conditions, really analyzing from the Caltrain standards, but also Union Pacific and our agreement with high-speed rail. But outside of this, Caltrain has agreed in our letter to take a system-wide approach to some of these questions and to engage in a conversation with UP to look at this at the quarter scale as opposed to project specific, to reduce the freight speeds and increase the allowable grades. So we shared our intent with UP during our quarterly coordination meeting. So we meet with them on a quarterly basis in November. We shared with them that we're going to begin to ask them questions about the maximum allowable grade, about the freight standards. And UP said they would be open to have those conversations. And so the corridor crossing study team is submitting the information, of course, to UP's public contact center, because UP also requires a reimbursement agreement in order to engage their team to recover their cost. But we have begun that process, let them know that we want to ask these questions on the corridor scale, have the corridor crossing team prepare the submittal to submit to begin the reimbursement agreement to engage their staff to ask these questions, like we committed in our letter. So that process is starting. And finally, as noted by Navi, we are committed to developing those tools and updating the electrification design standards. As I mentioned, we have our other standards were updated in August of 2020. We are at the 90% portion of updating our design criteria for electrification, still due at the end of this calendar year for the drawings and specifications for the electrified components. However, Caltrain still needs to be at the table to help apply these guidelines for the unique designs. And to borrow some of Nicole's talking points, many projects impact the operating safety critical systems that Caltrain expertise and judgment is needed. These are modifications to our traction power systems, our signal systems, our train control systems, our train to wayside communication. Those things require Caltrain expertise. They are operating systems that we need to keep safely in operation every day. But I'd like to turn the remainder of the presentation to share more information on service agreements to Nicole, who manages that process.
Thank you, Rob. So now I would like to spend some time. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'd like to spend some time walking rail committee members through the framework that enables Caltrain staff to allocate appropriate and valuable time to individual third-party projects, like rate separation projects. Service agreements are the framework. Service agreements are agreements between Caltrain and third parties, the project sponsor, established for Caltrain to support third-party project sponsors during their project development. So why do we have service agreements and why our services are needed? First, Caltrain is an operating railroad. I will use Rob's analogy. Working on an operating railroad is like open heart surgery. You need to keep the patient alive and functioning well. So for Caltrain staff, that means that we need to coordinate multiple projects simultaneously while ensuring that all our systems are in state of good repair and our service keeps running at an appropriate level. the how matters again, and it's not for a consultant to determine. Second, Caltrain has decision-making authority on what is acceptable. We have hundreds of pages of criteria, as Rob mentioned, and some of those items are stated as standards. Some are guidelines that require our staff judgment. So it's important that Caltrain retains the authority in these areas so that we can meet our fiduciary obligation and protect the health and safety of the public and workforce. Third, Caltrain has multiple operating systems, and Rob mentioned most of those systems. It's a reminder that they're safety critical. Modifying them as part of a third-party project requires our work. Fourth, capital projects have long-term operational and maintenance implications. Early design decisions have implications for those long-term operational and maintenance costs. Therefore, we have an obligation to provide our advice on those decisions in order to provide efficient and cost-effective service in the future. Fifth, Caltrain is required to coordinate with our tenant railroad, UP, and high-speed rail, as Rob mentioned. So now, why pay Caltrain? Caltrain receives public funds to deliver efficient and cost-effective rail service. That means all funds that we receive go towards the management, operations, and maintenance of Caltrain's commuter rail service. Great separations, therefore, are local jurisdiction projects. Local jurisdictions are also set up to seek that dedicated funding for those purposes. We know Measure B, W, A, and now Palo Alto Measure K. However, for all the reasons mentioned before, Caltrain staff time is necessary to implement those local jurisdiction great separation projects. And using Caltrain funds that are dedicated to operating and delivering rail services instead to advance a local jurisdiction funded great separation is not appropriate. Therefore, all great separation projects along the corridor use a cost recovery model, and service agreements, again, are a framework for Caltrain to recover its costs. Third, finally, Caltrain is set up to successfully build and deliver excellence. Over the past years, we have made steady progress on the goal to design and deliver excellence with the technical capacity and capability to lead. Caltrain has bolstered our engineering, project delivery, and program management teams by bringing over 20 new hires and promotions. All these efforts are intended to enhance our reporting tools and expand the palette of construction delivery options, taking more significant consideration into cost, schedule, and risk management. Next slide, please. We execute service agreements across our entire corridor. Service agreements support great separation projects, as well as bike and ped crossing projects and other municipal projects that impact the railroad right-of-way. This year, there were 3 service agreements under execution for Caltrain to support great separation bike and ped crossing projects during the early planning and design phases. We had a service agreement with Sunnyvale for the Mary Avenue and Sunnyvale Avenue great separations, as well as a service agreement for the Bernardo undercrossing, bike and ped undercrossing project. And the third is an agreement with the city of Menlo Park for the Middle Avenue bike and ped undercrossing project. More service agreements are currently being discussed, including with Palo Alto staff, to prepare great separation bike and ped crossing projects to further advance into preliminary engineering and environmental clearance, as well as final design. All these service agreements are similar to what we're discussing with Palo Alto staff. In addition, we have other agreements, memorandum of understanding, as well as cooperative agreements, support great separation projects and make major projects in South San Francisco for Linden Avenue, Great Separation, San Bruno, Mountain View, the City and County of San Francisco for the downtown extension, the City of San Jose for the Dearborn Integrated Station Concept Plan, and Burlingame for Broadway Great Separation. In some cases, MOU and cooperative agreements were executed right at the beginning of the conceptual design phase, when it was agreed upon that the project parties that Caltrain would lead from the beginning. Next slide, please. Now, let's deep dive into the scope in Caltrain's draft service agreement with Palo Alto. Like other service agreements we have established during the conceptual design phase for grade separation projects, Palo Alto's service agreement scope will include planning coordination and technical review of the 5 alternatives under consideration: Churchill partial underpass, Churchill Avenue closure with mitigation as the backup alternative, Meadow Charleston Trench, Meadow Charleston hybrid, and Meadow Charleston underpass. The technical review's primary goal is to vet viability of alternatives. As part of it, our staff identifies potential impacts to JPB facilities and their access, as well as impacts to operations and maintenance for each alternative. Caltrain staff identify specific facilities that may be affected by various alternative, third-party fiber optic cables, JPB fiber backbone, positive train control, communication, overhead catenary systems, track right-of-way access, etc. We also identify potential access impacts to JPB facilities as they relate to people walking, biking, and using buses and shuttles to access Caltrain services for each alternative. Also consider potential environmental impacts as well as necessary environmental clearances and resources agency permits for JPB to obtain at later design stages. Finally, the technical review includes a review of the community engagement, outreach plans, and materials. The service agreement scope also includes Caltrain staff assistance with implementation of our standards, policies, and interpretation of guidelines into actual design. Through the execution of the service agreement, we would address Palo Alto's question that require thorough and technical look at the alternative's unique characteristics and complexities. Once this scope is executed, the city gets to make an informed choice on its LPAs, knowing that they work. A few words about the conceptual design phase. Like for all other service agreements that we have implemented on grade separation projects, we make the assumption that Caltrain will become the lead implementing agency on the project after the community has selected their LPA and once the 15% design packet is complete. That means Caltrain will support the city of Palo Alto through the execution of its current contract with the conceptual design consultant and any subsequent documentation to 15% design. Once all 15% design elements have been determined, including right-of-way acquisition needs, impacts to Caltrain facilities, geotechnical reports, the handoff can happen. Next slide, please. Caltrain being the lead implementing agency means that Caltrain manages the design and delivery contracts for the project. In other words, Caltrain is the procurement lead. A handoff of the project from the city to Caltrain would be needed and has happened at different phases for different projects. But we'd like to emphasize that the preferred handoff approach is at the conceptual design phase. It's important to note that once Caltrain becomes the lead implementing agency, Caltrain keeps working with the project sponsor and funders throughout the life cycle of the project. The governance model for decision-making is clearly defined and described in the project's subsequent agreements. Grade separation projects are first and foremost locally sponsored, locally funded, and Caltrain is the implementation agent for those projects that has the knowledge about its right-of-way and is interfacing with our safety operating systems. Caltrain is working for the project sponsor, making sure the project is compatible with our systems operations. The handoff after the conceptual design phase is our preferred approach, and the milestone for a handoff that offers the most benefits for the project. Those benefits include tapping into our experience delivering other rail projects, including grade separation projects. For example, that experience has already taught us that and other municipal project sponsors that early involvement from Caltrain has value. Other benefits include the evaluation and selection of potential alternative contract delivery methods. That yields the highest benefits if selected at the locally preferred alternative project phase. At this stage, all alternative delivery methods can still be considered. Handoff at the end of the conceptual design phase also improves risk management. It allows for effective management of competing needs and products. And finally, cost and schedule have an opportunity to be streamlined. The handoff at the end of the preliminary engineering environmental phase, 35% design, is possible, but would be suboptimal. Next slide, please. Prior to the project being handed off, 3 more tasks need to be performed for the project to move into the next phase of work. Typically, it's the preliminary engineering and environmental clearance phase. That additional scope is listed on this slide and would be subject to an amendment of the service agreement that we have been discussing with staff. Following the selection of the LPA for Meadow Drive and Charleston Road, and prior to the end of the conceptual design phase, in order to compress schedule. This additional scope includes an alternative contract delivery analysis to recommend the optimal method based on the selected LPA's unique characteristics and complexities. This task typically evaluates the benefits of design build, progressive design build, and construction management general contractor, known as CMGC, in comparison to the traditional design build method, in order to select the most optimal method for a specific project. It is important to note what delivery method is best for the project. Expertise, size, and role of owner, designer, and contractor varies widely depending on the delivery method selected, which translate into different RFPs. For delivery method of other than design bid build, best practice is for one entity to manage the project from LPA through construction. It is also important to note that the delivery contract owner, here Caltrain, is legally required to perform and document this analysis for the project to be delivered using any other method than design bid build. The second task that would be added to the scope is the development of a cooperative agreement. This task includes the development and the execution of the cooperative agreement soon after the selection of the consensus recommended contract delivery method and its approval by the delivery contract owners board. The cooperative agreement will describe all parties' role and responsibilities for the next phase of the project, as well as the next design phase's overall scope of work and funding schedule. The execution of the cooperative agreement is a critical step towards issuing the RFPs for the next phase of the project in accordance to the consensus recommended contract delivery model selected through the previous as described. Third, the development of the RFPs for advancing the project beyond the conceptual design phase would also be included in that scope. It includes managing the procurement process, the interviews, and selecting the consultant for final design or preliminary engineering. Multiple RFP may be developed through this task. For example, if CMGC is selected through the first task on this slide, the RFP development task would include developing the RFP for preliminary engineering, final design, and design services during construction, and developing the RFP for CMGC pre-construction services during the preliminary engineering phase. Caltrain's goal is to compress schedule as much as possible because efficiency matters. Therefore, as soon as the city has selected all their LPAs, the 3 tasks described on this slide here can start being performed. This way, as soon as the city has developed the project's 15% design deliverables, the project can move directly into preliminary engineering and environmental clearance. Next slides, please. Thank you. To conclude, Caltrain's objective is to help the project to move forward. Next steps include continuing our ongoing coordination with Palo Alto staff on the corridor crossing strategy and detailed discussions with staff on the service agreement scope of work, budget, and deliverables in hopes of moving the project forward. We look forward in participating and partnering with city staff in pressing the service agreement forward. Thank you. And yeah. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Let's go out to the public first for public comments before coming back to committee. Madam Clerk?
Yes, Chair Koo, we do have one request to speak. 1 second. If anyone else would like to speak, please use the raise your hand feature. Mr. Adrian Britt, you can unmute yourself and speak for up to 3 minutes.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a few comments. Earlier, someone mentioned about the deferred maintenance. It was Mayor Burt. The deferred maintenance on the San Francisco Bridge. To my, I believe, accurate memory, that bridge has not been sandblasted or painted in 32 years that the JPD has owned the right-of-way. And actually going even further back, Southern Pacific, to my recollection, didn't take either. I've lived in this area a long time, and before the bike bridge was put in, we used to, many people crossed illegally, I should add, the train bridge. So that bridge, I agree, has been completely allowed to fall apart in terms of maintenance. Comment on the track width or the width required for tracks. Rob Bernard talked about 15-foot track centers. And in fact, Caltrain has numerous 4-track locations that I measured. Anywhere, the minimum is 60 feet. Tunnel Avenue up in Brisbane, there are 4 tracks on a bridge crossing the creek, and they fit in 60 feet. And those are all actively used current mainline tracks. Of course, some are used for passing. They're also at Lawrence and in Redwood City, and you can easily measure these at anywhere from 60 to 80 feet. So the 95 is perhaps a goal to have a generous maintenance road next to it. Regarding grades, the San Bruno grade separation that built the new station in San Bruno and grade separated, I believe, 3 different streets in downtown San Bruno, did get received. I don't know what the process was, but a grade exception. It has grades, I believe, on both sides in excess of 1%, significantly in excess of 1%. And to my recollection, it's worth checking, but I do not believe staff had to get permission or consult with EP and pay them money or anything of that nature. But I don't know for sure. It'd be interesting to know. It'd also be interesting to know other examples up and down the line where the grade exception was granted and implemented. So, but that's one where I know it was. And that's a relatively recent grade separation in downtown San Bruno. And then going back to the wayside horn comment, they are still noisy, and their primary purpose is to warn cars that are driving around the gates or tempted to drive around the gates. And thankfully, Caltrain has no significant history or problem with that particular issue. And a proper quiet zone, pedestrians can hear the train coming. And unfortunately, almost all pedestrian deaths are intentional on the Caltrain line. So wayside horns will not touch that problem because that's for safety, not intentional death. And a proper quiet zone would have quad gates such as Atherton's and all the other planned ones, and center medians, which make driving around the gates impossible. So I think wayside horns are more safety theater than actually effective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments. And the next speaker we have is in person is Nadia Nayak. You can go ahead and make your comments.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Just to kind of review old history here. So Measure B passed in 2016, which means and Palo Alto played a big role in actually making sure that Measure B passed, despite the fact that we had been hurt by previous tax measures, and getting money for grade separations was a big thing that we worked really hard on. By 2017, 2018, High Speed Rail had hired SMA, which was the Swiss firm, to look at what kind of passing tracks were needed. And it was kind of a bogus study because they didn't really look at Caltrain's needs, and it was something that was a source of great tension. Since 2018, the city of Palo Alto has had some form of consultant. It was not AECOM. We had a different consultant previously, but we have been working on this issue of where are these passing tracks going to go and what's going on. So it seems a little disingenuous to me that it's now 2022 and we're being told that we have to have a service agreement so that that can get answered. Because we've been spending money on our own consultants to work on this under the impression that the consultants were having reasonable and meaningful discussions with Caltrain. And it seems like those discussions were merely, here's our rule book, we'll talk to you once you want to pay us to be in a service agreement, which I don't believe was the attitude that we were getting from staff at the time. Because If so, Caltrain, as an agency that's made up of the 17 cities along the corridor, had a responsibility to turn around and say to the city, don't spend any money on consultants until you've done an MOU with us, because we can't do anything for you and we can't have any reasonable review, because we've spent 2 years, a lot of community process, and now we're being told, well, we can't answer your 4-track question. You seem to be able to answer it in Mountain View. It doesn't seem to me like couldn't at least get an answer in Churchill. So, I mean, it's super frustrating as a member of the public and someone who's been working on this. It really hurts Caltrain's reputation in the community. It hurts the ability of the cities to have any faith in these agreements. And then looking specifically at the issues that you're saying are either service agreement issues or system-wide issues. Minimum vertical clearance and bridge deck thickness is not something that is specific to an intersection. It's something that is specific to making sure that the cost of these grade operations doesn't overwhelm everybody. So we have an obligation, because we're spending taxpayer dollars, as you've said so clearly, to make these grade separation projects as efficient as possible. Having needlessly thick bridge decks makes it so that the road has to go down much steeper than it needs to, and all it does is blow money away. No, we don't have that money. So telling Palo Alto that, oh, well, if you sign an MOU with us, your vertical clearance standard and your bridge deck thickness, we can talk to you about that issue. That should be a system-wide issue. Everybody should have the thinnest bridge deck possible. And the minimum vertical clearance, obviously it's a safety issue, but as thin as you can get it, that's the number we should be working towards, because that's what gives us efficient grade separations. So I really hope that we can do something more. I understand that having an agreement is the easiest way for us to move forward, but frankly, we've been blown off for years at this point, and it's pretty frustrating. Thank you.
Okay, Chair Koo, that's the last request to speak.
Thank you so much. And we'll come back to the committee. Anybody want to go first? Councilor McCormack, Mayor Byrd?
So just following up on that last comment from Nadia on the 4-track zones and the service agreement relationship, as I've thought more about that history, even over the last couple of years, I had discussions with Caltrain staff, and I'm recalling that it was portrayed that Caltrain at that time was working on determining that zone, that it was an active process, and it was part of this staff capacity issue, but at no time in those discussions was that issue lumped into the necessity for a service agreement. Now, maybe that was just omitted, but it was several discussions, and it was never conveyed as part of what would have to fall under a service agreement. It was that Caltrain was actively working on making that determination. So I think that needs to be revisited. It does go back to the dilemma that we are mutually facing. So as you described, funding that Caltrain has doesn't cover the dealing with the certainly the individual grade separations. Does the funding that you have cover the grade separation corridor wide study? Does that have a separate dedicated funding source?
And that is a project specific funding source that came from part of Measure B, SFCTA, the Prop K, and some from San Mateo Transit Authority. So it's project specific funding for a specific activity.
So the problem that I think we're mutually facing is that first, the way Caltrain's funding exists today, not having funding to basically review individual projects, whether at the early stage or late stage, it means that we pay through our low funding of both city dollars and Measure B. We pay our dollars for all our staff, we pay all our consultants, and we pay your dollars. As we talked the other day about this being a collaborative and relationship, but it's collaborative, yes, but it's us having to pay you for your work, even though these projects really are driven by Caltrain's expanded service model. It's more trains that are necessitating the grade separations, and the Caltrain's a beneficiary of a grade separated system. It's really needed for an efficient, the full service model that Caltrain is anticipating really needs to have crossings grade separated. For years, Caltrain didn't recognize or acknowledge the need for full corridor wide grade separations. And over that course of time, I thought it was really a denialism because there wasn't any prospective source of funding, not just for the design parts, but the construction parts. So how could Caltrain accept essentially the necessity of that while they were moving forward with electrification when there was no foreseeable way to fund it? And so more recently, in the last 2-3 years, Caltrain has recognized that, and that was a good move. It was a necessity. As I mentioned the other day, actually, several of us worked to have a prospective MTC grant to Caltrain in 2016 for a corridor-wide study, and it was not endorsed by LPMG and not really fully endorsed by Caltrain staff at the time. That's water under the bridge, but it's not that this wasn't foreseeable. In any event, we now are in the circumstance that we are today, and we're ramping up grade separations. Caltrain over the years has been dealing with one every few years, primarily in San Mateo County. They had limited countywide dollars for this, and that was one level of Caltrain staffing capacity that's needed, and a different approach. But now we're ramping this up. We have multiple ones just in Santa Clara County that are proceeding at various stages, and Caltrain has responded with increasing your staff capacity and expertise to do that, to be able to respond to those needs. I would say that as Caltrain, you internally know how you've responded in adding your capacity to be able to meet those needs, whether you're being compensated for it by local cities or from outside funding. You've increased your capacity and your expertise. We don't have good visibility on exactly how you've increased that. So we're really facing that you're looking for us to go into service agreement without a clear enough understanding of exactly what your capacity and capabilities are, both breadth of capacity and the expertise capabilities and things. So that would be helpful, is for us to understand here are the changes that Caltrain has made over the last months or year or so that have staffed up to provide at least the core of people in place that have these abilities to not only deal with the design parts, but the construction management of multiple projects. And so that would be helpful. The other thing is that now that grade separating the system is a regional priority, I really think that there are prospective funding sources to have Caltrain receive their own pot of money to be able to support the city's needs, at least in these design standards. And I think that we collectively can work with our legislators to pursue some of those dollars. So having finished with kind of that part, I think my last comments are just around construction impacts. And I was thinking that that we each are very concerned with construction impacts. They tend to get put as a secondary ramification of a project, but they can be so consequential to the cities and incredible road disruptions that could be just gridlock, and very consequential to Caltrain if we're talking about bus bridges versus shoe flies versus maybe even more efficient designs that don't require either of those. And that goes back into even our alternatives analysis that the way the system's set up right now, we are not incentivized to select a design that has the least impacts on Caltrain. We're incentivized to have a design that has the least construction impacts on our community. But what we really need to do is be looking at both those issues. But in order for I don't even know how in the process the impacts on Caltrain gets considered. So which construction methods might require a bus bridge and shoe fly tracks slow can maybe depending on how severe the curve is, very slow speed and other ramifications. So how do we get that built into our collective approach? And right now the answer is we pay you more money to figure out what's important to you, I guess. And I think that's not a great model. So we need to think about how do we do it? We have sometimes common interests, sometimes different interests that are both equally important and need to be integrated somehow in an alternative selection. So that last part, I want to toss that out for any thoughts you have, because that just hasn't been getting discussed much, certainly internally here, and we don't want to get down the tracks a long ways and you say, oh no, we don't want you to do that alternative because it's too disruptive for service, which is a valid point, but there's not that dialogue and input right now.
So Mayor Bird, I appreciate, I think there are 2 points in a project to that help address that. During the initial alternative analysis, taking a look at constructability is really key because it's the impact to the community. It's not Caltrain, it's not Palo Alto, it's the public that we work for, and it's the transportation network that people rely on to get to work, to get to their activities of daily living, and taking a look at what alternatives would have the greatest impact to the community, and whether that's right-of-way, utility impacts, impacts on the local road network. There are multiple impacts, and taking a look at it a holistic view. And so there's a point at the early part that's important. And the second point in a project that is really helpful to do those analysis is if you do the alternative delivery analysis and it determines that, for example, a CMGC is the optimal delivery method, in those sorts of early contractor involvement, as they bring their expertise during the table from the 30% on through final design and into construction, you have those conversations on the conduct of construction. I was the director of the design and construction for the Green Line, which put light rail through the center of Portland downtown on 4th and 5th Avenues, 5th and 6th Avenues from one end of downtown to the other. How do you build that and still keep those businesses viable? The how mattered a lot. So we worked with the contractor in that CMGC model, that early contractor involvement, say, how do we build this thing and keep the patient alive? Because businesses rely on that access. And how do we build from building face to building face from one end of downtown to the other and not put anyone out of business? And so it's having those conversations about there's different ways to do construction. What's the optimal way to minimize the impact to the community, balanced with the cost for doing it different ways? And so you can have that informed decision. This might cost more, but has a lower impact. This might cost less, but have a higher impact. And you can make that value decision during that construction phase. So there's one early on which is just getting the talented minds together to roll up their sleeves and take a look at it holistically. It's not us and them, it's the community that we serve. And the other is rolling up your sleeves during the design phase to look at the ways to sequence, because the how matters a lot in what we do in building public infrastructure. Does that help answer at least the question somewhat?
Somewhat, but it's still under our current funding structure. You've got cities that are incentivized to minimize their direct costs, and you're a systems provider, so you're serving all the cities on the corridor, and so you're looking at both your Caltrain service impact and how disruptions of that service affect all of your member agencies. Individual cities are not going to be incentivized to focus on that, especially on their dollars. And so I do think we still have, in this regard, and it's a subset of the broader issues on this, but I think we do have a dilemma if you're putting the onus of funding for evaluation of construction impacts on the system and Caltrain onto the cities. That becomes problematic, and I think we got to sort this through. I think that's something that's principally your focus. It's not that we're indifferent to it, but and not just Palo Alto, but the individual cities are not going to be primarily focused on that. We'll have those of us who are wearing more than one hat and thinking about the system, the corridor, will be more focused on that than others. Others are going to say, these are dollars. It's and we got to focus on what will have the least disruption on our city. And so we have a tension and dilemma there, and we got to figure out how we sort through that, including I don't think you're going to get it resolved in the right way if you tell cities you need to pay us to think about our Caltrain interests and study our Caltrain interests and study the ramifications of alternatives on other cities in the corridor and the system. That doesn't sound like a good formula to get success. So I'm not looking for resolution today. I want to get that out on the table, and that's part of fleshing out what are the rough edges in these agreements, and what do we need to think through and figure out how we come up with a solution to it. So, thanks.
Councilmember Cormack.
Thank you, Chair Koo. There's a lot to work with here. I appreciate the details in the slides, and I'm a little confused by our prior conversation because we were talking about 4-track, and I think Mr. Bernard, you were referencing that would be in the service agreement, but the slide suggests that's in the corridor crossing. So,
Councilmember Cormack, let me see if I can speak with more clarity and also help with responding to what Dean had said. In the letter that we had responded to Palo Alto, there were two different paths. One is we're doing this corridor crossing study that has defining the 4-track segments with more specificity, and that'll take us some time, but it has funding. We have a consultant team on it. There is a public process. I know it's been a little behind schedule. There's a couple of years of a COVID got in the way, but we're now launching that effort. If there was a need to get an answer today, the answer is like we did with 25th Avenue, is not preclude, which says that design it, but don't preclude a 4-track. If there's a middle ground of, I really want an answer now, I don't want to do not preclude, and I don't want to wait, then it's roll up the sleeve to do a service agreement. But what we've done before is, if we don't have an answer with the high-speed rail, it's not preclude, or we wait for this process. But if we need to do a middle ground, then that's the service agreement. And so the letter said, here's not preclude or wait. But if you really, really need an answer now, I think the only other alternative that I saw was a service agreement. Now, that's obviously an element for discussion, but that's why I went to, well, there's not preclude or wait. But if we did it now, the only way to do that is actually to do the work. So that was my response to that, if that has any
Yeah,
clarity.
no, that's helpful. I guess then for our staff, at which of the current crossings then are we most concerned about this? Would we be limiting this discussion? Or would we be asking?
So, excuse me, actually the matrix that was provided, I think actually addresses this precisely, but it really is, it does have implications at all of the
all
different
of them.
crossings and all the alternatives.
Lovely.
But that was the
Okay.
intention of the matrix.
Okay, well, we will have to sort that out cooperatively. Okay. So let me test my understanding on these various types of agreements. The service agreement is at the beginning, and then there are also third-party agreements, which are,
They're all third party, but there are different,
but they're not three-party.
excuse me, 3-party.
No, some of the third
Third.
party are not three-party.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'll let Nicole answer. I'm
But,
sorry.
Okay. All right. So service agreement is at the beginning. And then eventually does everything end up as a cooperative agreement? Or is there some other method that we would eventually be in?
I'll try to answer that question. So to your point about service agreements being with third party, yes, their service agreements are typically between the project sponsor and Caltrain. They don't include the funder. The funder, in some cases, VTA, does have a chance to review the draft service agreement as they work with the project sponsors, but they're not a party to the agreement. They are at the beginning, but other agreements sometimes have been implemented also at the beginning with more parties to the table. When Caltrain was the lead implementing agency from the very beginning. On other projects, in other jurisdictions, Caltrain has led the conceptual design phase. So Caltrain has owned the contract with the consultants to develop multiple alternatives, review them with the city, and make a decision. Again, those agreements still had the city as the project sponsor, but Caltrain was the lead implementing agency. So there's some nuance there. All projects would end up with a cooperative agreement or a MOU in some other jurisdictions. That's how we call them, at least for from final design phase through construction. It is our Caltrain policy to implement those projects for all the reasons that I described in the presentation. And Caltrain also prefers earlier handoff. So right after the conceptual design phase to become the lead implementing agency as soon as the preliminary engineering phase starts, to also lead the environmental clearance process. So yes, their cooperative agreements are needed as a next step.
Okay. And then, so Mr. Kami, what percent are we at in our current designs? Because I see there's a lot of discussion of when we hand off and all of that. And I realize it's a little bit of an art, but if you had to put a number on what we are looking at, what's your number?
Well, we're certainly at pre 15%. So we're not past that number that we would hand off.
Okay. And is 15% the level at which you also think we should be handing off? Putting you on the spot?
Yeah, so 15%, I believe, is when we would get into what Caltrain has referred to as a second agreement for them to take over as the lead. What's the term? Lead implementing agency, or?
Okay, so conceptually, having you all help us vet the viability of alternatives under consideration is great. But that's what we've been, hoping for, because we've been making assumptions and we certainly have hopes and dare I say dreams, but we need to know what's gonna fly and what isn't. How much, just ballpark, have the service agreements cost, say, Mountain View? So it looks like Ringstorff has taken the longest. Do you know how much Mountain View spent on the service agreement so far?
I don't have the answer to that. What I could hint on is that Mountain View currently has a cooperative agreement, I believe, and they're further advanced in the design of their projects, and so those costs are typically higher than
Of
the
course.
service agreements
Yeah.
cost that we're contemplating for Palo Alto grade separation projects, because also the scope is different. The scope really is based on what phase the project is in.
Well, I mean, Ringstorff, they said that the council's been consistent on the design for 20 years, which sounded amazing to me. That's really relevant information. So to speak about this conceptually is one thing, but I'm willing to bet it's a budgetary item.
Yeah, we'll happy to provide that information.
Yeah. It very helpful to have what other people have spent to date, and then any general ballpark of what this might be. So I heard you say that the goal is to compress schedule. And that's in the cooperative agreement stage or just in general?
That's in general. And if I could, Councilmember Cormack, talk a little bit about that. One of the goals that we all aspire to using public money is to try to do them efficiently as possible and try to not make activities start finish. We're going to do A, and only when A is done, we'll do B, and when B is done, then we'll do C. In these project deliveries, you try to nest some of those activities because, for example, procurement takes about 6 months. And you have the RFP development issuance, and are the ways to nest that activity in order to eliminate that 6-month delay.
Mhm.
Are there ways with procurement for construction in order to compress that schedule by overlapping? And some of these alternative contract delivery methods allow you to nest those processes to compress schedule, allow for early construction packages, long lead material procurements, early utility relocation, while the design is still being complete, and allows you to negotiate a total contract price before the 100% drawings are done. And that allows you to compress that 6-month bidding period. So that's the notion of can we compress these things with alternative delivery methods to save us
Okay.
all money and time?
Okay, so it's more about the alternative delivery methods and less about the agreement itself.
Well, Councilman McCormack, the agreements allow us to prepare the products to do those things and nest preparing some of those products while we're approaching 50%. So if we're preparing an RFP for design services, that could be done at the same time as getting the approval of 15%. And so it doesn't happen after. You can do it at the same time to compress some of those, even without the alternative delivery methods.
So I'm just gonna check in with staff. None of this sounds super revolutionary. Don't we tend to do this on our projects already? Okay, all right. I'm seeing nods for those of you not watching, listening. Okay. And then I guess what I can imagine is a scenario under which we would like to take more time while we're vetting viability of alternatives. And I don't know how that would work. I don't know how it would work once, we're in the selection time here. And I'm just looking at this and you're saying help with viability of alternatives under consideration. And that's where I imagine we could spend a great deal of time.
So the service agreement is based on, we charge our time like a consultant. Every hour that I work, I've billed to a project or to another task if it's supporting the operation of the railroad.
So 6-minute increments, or you bill an hour increments?
No, I usually bill in 15-minute increments.
All right, just checking. Okay.
Right. I'm not an attorney. My son's an attorney. So, but we only bill when we're actually working on the project, and it's who worked on it, what's their hourly rate, what's their fringe, and when the overhead. I think the current overhead rate is 3.48% or something for FY23. There is an overhead rate that's been an audited overhead rate, but it's the actual what are they doing, what they work on, what was their billing rate. It's based on the actual. And if we're not working, we don't bill, right? So if it's in a public process and it's going through and we're not doing any work, there's no bill coming. But if we're participating and doing an actual review, a submittal comes in, participating in a public meeting to provide support, they would bill those time.
And then who's going to ask them to do work, right? Is it you? Is it you? Is it us? Is it the council? Like, I'm just talking nitty gritty because it's taken so long to get to here. And here we do not have, even at Churchill, we have like a primary and a secondary alternative. So
Yeah, to muddy that, excuse me, muddy that a little more. I think that's going to depend on the
okay,
scope
what?
of services.
You want to muddy it more?
Yeah, to muddy it more, I think it would depend on the scope of services.
Yeah. Well, I think
So as
this
we
is gonna
refine
take-
that,
I think this is going to take a long time, frankly, just listening to us to sort of work through what's happened, to figure out how much time we would need. And, I certainly share people's frustration about what's happened in the past. And we can be unhappy about that. And then we have to figure out how to move forward. And we need to do both of those things. So, yeah, I would say I look forward to seeing the service agreement, but I look forward to the service agreement being provided to people who I know will look at it carefully.
Just wanted to make a quick comment based upon your last statement. I do want to emphasize that throughout this process, I think it has been a lot of lessons learned, and we've been working and coordinating with city staff to really understand the needs of the city of Palo Alto as we can, and as we do with various service agreements along the corridor. And part of that, what this means is the intent of today's meeting was to ensure that you all had a framework of what a service agreement it is, and ask questions like, what is a cooperative agreement and what are the next steps for the process? And so I've really been framing this as the part one to many parts of what's going to lead us to an eventual understanding of a service agreement that the city is comfortable with moving forward, as well as Caltrain. And so wanted to just wanted to set that or preface that, as this will likely be an ongoing conversation about building trust and transparency, so that we can demonstrate where Caltrain capacity is and stands. And so appreciate all the questions and wanted to reassure folks that we do understand the timing, especially the community engagement component.
Yeah, and just on the money, like we're coming up on mid-year and we start our budget planning early. So if this is going to be a budget item, our folks need to know.
And we are happy to continue to engage in our conversations with staff, because you've heard me say many times the details matter. Where's each of these crossings at in its project life cycle? What services are needed at this particular crossing for this alternative? What hours need to be spent? What are the deliverables? What support they need? And it varies for each project along the corridor depending on where they are. It's not one size fits all. So we sent here's our standard template. That's a starting point for long conversations. What is really, really needed for this community to advance their vision, and how can we help? And so it's just the start of a conversation.
Thanks so much.
So I'll just say that my comments kind of align with the mayor as well as Nadia. But I also appreciate a lot of the questions that Councilmember Cormack has brought up to get the conversation started. I think as I was listening to the presentation, it just kind of, the phrase early involvement has value. And I know that you're a new team. I'm very happy to see you here now, but early involvement was maybe 2 or 3 years ago when we were kind of going through, business plan and the Caltrain's business plan and all of that. It should have been worked on simultaneously so that we wouldn't have to be going through what we're going through now. And I do have to say, this agreement that has just I mean, this is the first time I'm hearing about it, and the cost that the city is going to have to bear on something that it's because of Caltrain's increased service. So And because of that service, now our streets are going to be impacted perhaps with traffic and congestion. So definitely it's going to involve a lot more discussion and being transparent and also having more conversations. And so I'm not going to, reiterate what was already being said, but I think that's a lot of surprises here today. Anyway, anybody want to? Oh, Mayor Burt.
I have I had a couple follow-ups if that's okay.
Yes, please do.
So first, I do want to say that this discussion today is really nice, that it is able to be thoughtful and composed and diving into the depth of the issues. And I think this is a good way to approach it. A lot of times we try to rush through things and it just truncates what is needed to really flesh out. I also appreciate just the last comment on the criticality of utilities. As I've become more and more familiar with kind of mega project issues, and that the utility impacts are so often treated as an afterthought at the beginning, and yet they become horrendous. And this goes into a lot of what kind of Rob was talking about, this iterative process, because too often, and this is what we've basically been told by our consultants for the last several years of, oh no, that only gets looked at way down the line here. And it didn't make sense to us on how we could make a decision that could be completely altered and disrupted by discoveries down the line. And you only do the preliminary evaluation of that impact, whether it's the utility impacts or geotechs or whatever, at a certain point pretty far down the path. It makes it very difficult to reverse yourself. Of course, it does mean that you pay again for all that consulting work, and I think that's part of the dilemma of the process if consultants aren't well managed. And so in a lot of ways, you're really now staffed up and stepping up as, at a certain point in time, an alternative to the consulting process, the outside consulting process. And that's what we have to get a better understanding of. Okay, well, we've got the pipeline of additional studies that we're in the middle of with a consulting group. We'll have a certain overlap with you folks with this service agreement. And then there appears to be a period where it might transition to even a deeper role for you, your organization, and figuring out how all that flows and moves from the way we've been approaching it to how we might approach it is something we have to think through better. And I did have a question too on when you're the grade issues of vertical grade and vertical curve both, that can be so impactful if there are designs that go up or down, or frankly, if we're considering a design that goes up or down. And we might choose it if the vertical grade and vertical curve are changed, or we might reject it if it's not. Are there any of the grade separations that have been going on in the corridor over the years that have been other than the 1% curve and grade?
Like I Mayor Burt, that'd be something I have to get back to you on. There's been, I think there were 6 that were done back at the in the 90s. Then I think there was one done in 2002, and then another one done in 2014. But so there's been 8 of them. So I'd have to look at those. And
you alluded to with the UP agreement on them maintaining competitive service levels, and that kind of zeroed in on the aspect of okay, they have rights on the corridor, and they aren't infinite rights, and yet they're substantial rights. And where do you draw that boundary? And it seems that it is going to be around the argument on what maintains competitive service levels. So they could be required to accommodate a steeper grade, a 2% or maybe a 3%, but it might mean that they're fully loaded freight cars might either have to travel at a slower speed to accommodate a vertical curve, or might have to have less weight to be able to meet a vertical grade, as I understand it. Is that kind of a rough?
Or an additional locomotive.
Got it. But that doesn't necessarily make them non-competitive. Not necessarily.
Mayor Burt would be for Union Pacific to illuminate us on how it impacts their service. But I've worked with Union Pacific for a good portion of my career. And they are a business.
Yeah,
we'll leave it at that.
Well, and we know that by reputation, they're going to fight for their interests, and those interests may be either their service levels or compensation for what they would argue would be some modification of their cost of service. And yeah, so that my point is that goes in. It's both. We have this narrowed gray area of what constitutes competitive service levels and how much can we tweak things within that, and then a negotiation. Yeah. And one of the things that several of us have argued to some of the legislators and to MTC committees, and there was receptivity to this, is that if we look at the aggregate cost impacts of either beneficially getting some of these changes through all the grade separations in the quarter, or conversely not getting them, that figuring out a resolution to UP can be over the corridor incredibly cost effective, and that's part of the negotiation. But I think that there's something that Friends of Caltrain and CART have been pointing out for several years, and is hopefully becoming from your staff coming in a recognition that we need to get a systems solution with UP, so that all these grade separations that might have lower costs, if we get fixes, can then start incorporating them. And the sooner we do it, the sooner we make a right preferred alternative selection. So if we're, we get, it's like, whether it's this issue or we're just talking about Churchill, and Councilmember Cormack was saying, well, we still haven't decided certain things. As I've discussed with you, we had argued that with reduced bridge decks or lack of a center pillar, we could have a more viable alternative at Churchill. And we've been going back and forth on this for some time. And so what isn't well understood by a lot of the public or the press is that once we get these technical and design standards and can have the most cost-effective approach, we can move forward on a decision much easier. But if we're forced to make a decision now, we're forced to make the more costly, more impactful decision. And that's the dilemma we're all in right now until we get these resolved. Okay, I think that's everything I had. I just say again, I really appreciate this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no more comments, then I want to thank Train for coming out today and having this frank discussion with us, and taking back what we have made comments on. And we can move on to our next item, which is next steps and future agendas. So staff, would you like to take that?
Yes, thank you, Chair Koo. I think that our next meeting would potentially be scheduled for January 18th, although I'm not sure if that fits within the calendar that council would have for selecting a new member of the committee. I think that if I remember correctly, I think the first council meeting is the 9th. I might be remembering dates incorrectly. So there's a council meeting in January on the 9th, and then the meeting of the following Monday, the 16th, is canceled. And then there's a meeting that following Monday. So I'm not sure if that the meeting schedule fits within our needs to select another member for the committee, but happy to.
So I'll just offer one point of clarification. Those committee selections don't go back to the council. They're just made by the mayor. So that can be done in the interim period. And since we have two members of this committee that are continuing on the council, if push came to shove, we could still do a meeting with two members. So I'd be inclined to keep us on schedule.
I think usually though, the members don't carry over, right? The mayor assigns new members each year.
Not they don't carry over, but they can be
Of
reassigned.
course they can, yeah, but
Okay.
I don't think it's standard.
just-
They just continue.
Yeah, I'm inclined to keep the date as well and see if the assignments can be done as soon as possible by the mayor.
Yeah, so noting that, I just want to mention that I personally have a conflict on the 18th. I have a VTA technical advisory committee that I'm the chair of. So if we'd possibly find another date, that would be helpful for me. Oh, and I'm sorry. So also noting that and we're getting a message from the clerk that we might not be able to publish an agenda on time for that
For the 18th.
January 18th meeting. So maybe that's
Push it out 1 week.
Yeah,
that
I
could
can
be a
say the
reason.
25th. Is that something that can be done? So why don't we look at the 25th then?
Okay, so we will look for the 25th, assuming 25th is fine with our attorney, and seems like it should be okay with our clerk.
Okay, super duper. Then we'll chat about the agenda offline, and if there's nothing else, then I will call adjournment. Thank you so much to everybody. Have a good afternoon.